just as kind of, just as people, give them a bit of time to filter in. Okay, so I can sort of see people just coming in now, which is great to see. Okay, so welcome. I think we'll make a start, Chrissy. Obviously, people will sort of filter in over the next few seconds as well. But welcome to the University of Suffolk Learning and Teaching webinar series. This is the last session of 2023, and we're joined by Dr. Chrissy Da Costa. And Chrissy is an academic skills advisor here at the University of Suffolk, and she's also part of the Anti-Racism Collective here at the University of Suffolk. Now, Chrissy's going to talk to us about we don't need no anti-racism education, and questions whether this is the anthem of higher education. So Chrissy's going to talk for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then there's going to be some time for questions afterwards as well. But as Chrissy is talking, please do put your questions in the chat, and I will put them to Chrissy after she has finished speaking. So Chrissy, without any further delay, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for your interest in discussing whether racism operates in higher education and whether HE, that's higher education, accepts and practices anti-racism. I think I should say that I'm not going to be making any earth-shattering revelations. I'm not disclosing any secret handshakes, but I'm going to be discussing what we see and know, but may possibly fail to acknowledge and address. And I should also add that as we are discussing anti-racism and speaking up against domination and discrimination, that I have a moral responsibility and obligation to speak up, if I have a sense of humanity, to speak up against the massacre of innocent lives, children in Palestine. I say that because I hope I always speak up against the persecution of minorities, the caste violence in fascist India. So for today, my contention is that the default position of higher education is we don't need no anti-racism education. I will explain why I make this claim and why I think it should not be the reigning ideology or sentiment. Before we discuss whether or not anti-racism is needed or whether or not it is missing in HE, we need to understand whether there is racism. And some questions might possibly guide us to examine the environment. Is there racism? How does it manifest itself? What's the response to the racism? What do these responses indicate? So let us take the first 2 points. Is there racism? And what's the nature or what are the forms of racism? Perhaps a critical examination of some statements made in higher education might help us to understand. And these are statements that have been actually uttered in HE spaces. International students always come late for lectures and workshops. They need to be taught British values. Black girls have such attitude. How many of the tribe are going to be attending your graduation? This was made to a Black student. I'm sure you know how to get guns and knives, again to a Black student studying at the Royal School of Drama in London. I would like to add a point out here that I would prefer to use the term Black, but I use the terms Black and Black and global majorities. I've tried to avoid using only the term Black, as I'm aware that some people might feel I'm appropriating a term that people of African heritage have claimed to define themselves. I'm also mindful that people of African heritage bear the greater burden of racism, including racism from other people of color. So before we discuss these comments, let us look at some other comments that have been made in official spaces. And these are spaces such as classrooms, at conferences, at committee meetings. And what are these statements? The reason for the attainment gap are these students do not have language barriers. They lack confidence, and maybe their prior attainment was very poor. Or another statement, oh, the Black students do not have a culture of learning. Or these BAME students do not read classical literature. They are not academically oriented. Students who have English as an additional language tend to get low grades. So there seems to be a kind of racial profiling taking place out here, assuming that students who have English as an additional language doesn't mean that their academic ability is anyway compromised. I call these statements victim blaming statements. They are a form of veiled racism. They might appear seemingly innocuous, but they are inaccurate assumptions stemming from a false sense of superiority of themselves and inferiority of people they perceive to be different. So if we take the sentence of the statement about classic literature, it raises an important point as to why text in other languages, such as Mandarin or Arabic, are not considered classic literature. It reveals an epistemic narrowness, or what Charles Mills calls conceptual or theoretical whiteness, that excludes knowledges and experiences of groups that are not white. And so such statements emerge from a blinkered view of what constitutes valid knowledge and reinforce, according to George Yancey, the nullification of knowledge systems that are not white, and so they uphold white supremacist beliefs. These utterances subscribe to a hegemonic view that Ailing discusses as constructing whiteness and whites as superior to blacks and blackness. And there have been calls that these racial myths should be disrupted. But what does it mean to disrupt these myths? What does it entail? And Heringer insists that teachers or academics should understand their roles in epistemological domination and ensure that students' knowledge and culture is validated rather than silenced. Odeni 2020 also concurs that teachers should recognize the linguistic, cultural, and epistemological diversity in their classrooms, which some academics fail to do. But racism is not only at the individual level, it's also embedded in institutional structures, systems, and practices. And if we take the first statement, there seems to be an institutional failure to recognize the real reason for the gap. Fortunately, some scholars have already started referring to it as the awarding gap, but some policy documents persist in calling it the attainment gap. So attributing the gap to deficits, imagined deficits, and not to the barriers or structure of racism that could be preventing some students from achieving as per their potential. And so they would call for remedial education, academic support. So there seems to be an unwillingness to explore and understand and address the real reasons for the gap. This has been well documented in the literature. Harper, for instance, Sean Harper has looked at 255 journal articles, and he said they all talk about the gap talk, but without citing racism as a barrier to achievement. So he goes on to say that instead of viewing racial differences as byproducts of institutionalized racism that requires systemic organizational change, these authors suggest other approaches that have little to do with investigating and responding to the realities of racism on campus. Other studies by Bunce et al. Found that there were differences in attainment could be due to barriers such as societal and institutional racism. Even a Cabinet Office report in 2018 talked about this. A study by the NUS found that 1 in 6 students who they identified as a global majority reported that they experienced subtle and covert racism or more explicit racism. But instead of trying to identify the real reasons, HEIs, that higher educational institutions, claim that they are trying to identify students who are at risk of withdrawing from university. So these, using such terms as high risk problem students, give the impression that these students are afflicted with a malady. And Malcolm Tite calls this victim blaming, holding students responsible. So in claiming that students from non-traditional backgrounds are more likely to perform poorly, and the institution presents itself as very at good intentions of trying to help them. So this deficit view is camouflage. Let's try to now look at the whether it's true that students from less privileged backgrounds, students who are first generation perform, or from Black students perform poorly in education, and whether the gap is real. Now, what we see out here is that there is a gap. White students at university are graduating, 82% of white students are graduating with a good degree, that is the first or upper second. Whereas 60%, only 60% of Black students who come to university are graduating with a good degree, and 71% of Asian. So there is a gap. But is the gap due to the lack of academic ability, the deficits of the students? And the next slide will probably give us an answer. Out here, you will see that students coming to university with similar entry grades are leaving university, and there is a difference. So the Black students and the white students are coming with triple A's, good from when they leave school, are coming to university, but still the other Black students are underperforming. Or the Black students and white students are coming, say, with three C's, but then even then there is a difference between the Black and the white students. So there's something else going wrong, that there are barriers to attainment. The potential of these students is being stifled. But there seems to be a reluctance to acknowledge the real reason, to identify them. Let's return to some comments that are made, other comments that are made. And these are comments that are directed specifically towards staff before we explore the discussion. Okay, before I come to the other comments, I would just like to show you this slide. And there was a study done by Gilborn and Mirza, and they found that they tested school students in one borough in London, or in several boroughs in London, and they found that at age 5, at entry to school, Black students were 20 points above the national average and 10 points above the white students. But when they left school at age 16, you can see the Black students were 20 points below the national average. So what has gone wrong? Education seems to have failed these students. Okay, let's return to some other comments that were uttered in higher education and directed specifically towards Black staff. Only teaching staff are allowed to enter here. or to park here. And these are actual statements that were made. When are you serving the tea and coffee to Black academic staff? Or another statement that was made in the context of discussing reading lists for a course, a history course. We should wipe out all the Arabs. These, I would say, are more overtly aggressive comments, are frequently uttered. And they've been discussed in the academic literature. If you can read articles by Jason Arday, Remy Joseph Salisbury, Nirmal Pawar, articles in the United States that have listed out the utterances directed towards Black staff and students. Now, some people might claim that in the genteel space of AG, overt racism doesn't happen. It happens out there on the streets. But subtle and direct racism is an everyday occurrence. We need to bear this in mind and the possible impact of these in terms of the self-confidence, the self-esteem, the mental health and academic performance. So having established that racism operates within AG, let us examine what is the response. We will discuss whether there is a reluctance to acknowledge and address racism, a failure to practice anti-racism, and to ensure an anti-racism environment and culture. So racism is rife, but the denial of racism is also rife. What are some of the responses? Let's take the responses to microaggression. Dismissing as unconscious or jokes. I don't like the word unconscious, the phrase microaggressions, because these are not really microaggressions. These are, they build up, they accrete. These are regular occurrences, and they diminish people. So one way today is say that, okay, dismiss it as unconscious. So one way of response is dismissing it. Oh, these are just jokes. Or when students report that they've been encountered racism or microaggressions, to say that you need to develop resilience. So there's a tendency to claim that these are not forms of racism, that they stem from unconscious bias, that they are said in jest. But calling these jokes or unconscious is dismissing the racism, minimizing the impact, and is itself a form of racism. Several scholars have established how racism is entrenched in institutional structures and practices, which Bonilla Silva calls a racialized structure. Philomena Esset explains that racism is both structure and process. It is built into systems of domination and kept alive through enactments, that is, through statements like that we just discussed, by attitudes and behavior. Others have said that racism is across a broad spectrum of human activity, and education has a role in contributing to and practicing everyday and racialized forms of racism, racialized structures. Now, I'm aware that this talk is focusing on racism and anti-racism, but I'm also aware that other forms, and I'm concerned about other forms of oppression and domination operating in educational spaces and society, especially in India, in the form of casteism, which is as evil, oppressive, and inhumane as racism. Drawing on the insights of Purkayastha, Slate, Danda, and Prasad, it can be said that these similarities, there are similarities between, and I see the similarities between white supremacy and Brahminic supremacy. Both are forms of racism that classify people as superior and inferior. And I hope that I can get some time to start writing. I have spoken about it, to start writing about and exploring casteism and Brahminic supremacy. So they are based on false notions of superiority of some groups. These false beliefs have been analyzed in different ways, as unconscious, as epistemologies of ignorance, Charles Mill, and as disconsciousness by King. So the concept of unconsciousness lets the person making racist comments or engaging in racist practices off the hook. it claims that these utterances emerge unconsciously or unintentionally as part of the socializing process, whereby the utterer develops their thoughts from their social environment. But if the proponents of unconscious bias claim that the social environment is responsible for shaping thoughts, then that should logically follow that the social structure needs to be changed. But they halt their interventions at just changing mindsets. Z.S. Leonardo, David Gilborn, Carl Kitching, Shirley Ann Tate, and others have argued that bias training workshops merely raise consciousness of racism and biases, but do not lead, I would say, to the awakened souls taking responsibility to tackle racism and becoming aware of their complicity in upholding it. Evans, Winters, and Hines 2020 also argued that diversity training is limited without focusing on white supremacy as a system that enables domination and discrimination. So the other concept of disconsciousness, which is, I credit to Joyce E. King, who came up with it many years ago, and it explores the limitations of the concept of unconscious bias. She argues that it is not unconsciousness that leads to inaccurate assumptions about people who identify as Black and global majorities, but disconsciousness, that is an impaired consciousness that disables their thinking about racism. So an unconscious mind would not be aware or would lack knowledge, whilst a disconscious mind is limited in their thinking and understanding, and so unable to become aware despite being surrounded by knowledge and information. However, I find that disconsciousness also has certain limitations. It is useful to understand the distorted thinking of some minds who see themselves in a position of superiority in relation to others, but it does not fully address the willful ignorance. And this is where Charles Mills's concept of willful ignorance, of those who choose to be ignorant of their own shortcomings and falsely perpetuate the myth of their superiority. In other words, they are aware, but they choose to ignore the reality of racism. So Charles Mills's concept of epistemologies of ignorance goes beyond the concepts of both unconscious bias and disconsciousness. And this ignorance, as Mills explained, is part of the racial contract. So it's part of the structure. So you may not be practicing racism, but that you are kind of subscribed to the structures and systems. You're part of that. And this concept of willful ignorance is similar to Meena Danda's point in reference to caste domination, where she correctly notes that the refusal to see and listen to the pain of caste domination is an ethical failure. So the concept of ethical failure. She explains that it's not an inability, but a refusal to understand. And this refusal or this willful ignorance is not just at the individual level, but at the institutional and structural level. That's what I say. So what is another response to the racism or the racist environment? So we spoke about dismissing. The other one is about denying that it is racism, refusing to acknowledge that it is racism. How do you know that it is racism? It could be a security issue. This was posed to me once when I was doing a workshop for the senior leadership team. And I mentioned about how Black staff were actually stopped, or people put their hand and lifted the lanyard to examine the lanyard, the ID card of a staff member. And this could be a security issue they didn't know. And there's a paper that I would suggest people read by Remy Joseph Salisbury in 2019, talks about Black bodies out of space. And he discusses a former graduate of Oxford University returned the next year after some years to Oxford University to catch up with some of his friends there. Now, he did a degree in PPE, which is prime ministers have, UK prime ministers have had the degree, and has invest people with a lot of political capital. So you would have thought that as he would have had that capital. But when he went there to the university, there was a notice circulated and posted all over Oxford University's spaces online, saying that with his picture, because they must have got it from some security camera, saying, who is this person? Please report him to security. We need to, what is he doing out here? So there seems to be an assumption of white with intellect, black with criminality. And this is what, when the staff, senior leadership staff, all white, said, how do you know that is racism? I asked them, I said, did you have you been ever stopped in spaces in academia? Because maybe you were new staff, and they just murmured, no, a very low no. So there is a denial or unwillingness to admit that this kind of stop and search is racist. Akala writes about how the first time he was stopped and searched was at the age of 13. Talk to any other white person who was an 18-year-old young boy in Britain and whether they have been stopped and searched. Of course, I'm not saying that there will be no white people stopped and searched, but it's common for a black person to be identified and to be suspect. Now, this is saying that it's not racism, and Alana Lenton in a 2018 paper says not racism is a form of racist violence, because there is an attempt to sideline or deny race and the experience of people who have experienced racism. But she also goes on to say that the determination of the racially dominant to define the reference of racism is not in itself new. It happens, and there's a ways of trying to cover it up. And that's also equally common. So another response to racism is not acknowledging racism, deflecting, which is very devious. So one way of deflecting is through claiming victimhood. There was a discussion at a conference about we should be focusing more on racism and anti-racism. And people said that, why focus only on racism? As a white woman, I face race oppression. You could read papers by, and I call that claiming victimhood, papers by Alison Phipps, who calls this white tears. And she said, trauma can be disclosed to generate further capital in the form of feeling and creating political gain. And she goes on to say that white feminists have been slower to acknowledge our own tendency to be lachrymose, which is an attempt to avoid accountability in response to criticism by women of color. She further adds that the damsel in distress is evoked as a protective response, which simultaneously portrays people of color or blacks as aggressive and frightening. So deploying this white tear, the device of white women's tears, has been used to deny humanity of others, to dehumanize. Another devious deflection is what I would call whataboutery. What about white working class? Why are you focusing on race and racism? And I would say, what is stopping anyone from dealing with the issue of white working class in education? The fact that they are lagging behind has got nothing to do with their racial character. Focusing on racism doesn't mean that you've got to ignore the issue of white working class in education. But this is a ploy, and we'll talk about racial capitalism. It's about the juxtaposition of white working class with victim of racism. Seems to be a way to fracture solidarity. As Frederick Douglass long time ago argued, that to insist on such division is to overlook that it is in the interest of capital to pit white workers against black workers. And we'll come to this point about racial capitalism, about how capitalism requires this inequality and racism provides that. So denials are the form of racial violence, to silence, invalidate black voices, preventing black people from raising awareness of the experiences of racism. So failure to respond to racism or the response to racism that I've outlined out here are part of the racial architecture and serve to maintain racism. They are complicit in racism. As Bonilla Silva argues, that systemic racism is the product of the behavior and practices of regular folks rather than of the racist. But not recognizing racism also has an impact on people. It could impact a sense of belonging. It could make people feel that they're not taken seriously. There have been studies that have shown by Doherty et al. In 2021, Jason R. Day and Mirza, Jackson, Billings and Tate, Salisbury and Johnson, Rollock, who talk about Black staff in academia made to feel like outsiders, that they do not belong, experiencing stress and anxiety. So racism is endemic, and Katie Sian says that it's endemic in university spaces. There have been reports called Tackling Racial Harassment, and that shows that 1 in 20 students said they left their studies due to racial harassment, and 3 in 20 staff said racism caused them to leave their jobs. They also found that students felt anxious, depressed, and 8% contemplated taking their lives. Similarly, and many staff reported the same. So the report of Tackling Racial Harassment goes on to say there needs to be leadership to help embed a culture where racial harassment is not tolerated. But heeding the call of Bonilla Silva, I would say that we need to spend less time studying racial attitudes of people and more time examining the specific mechanisms, practices, social relations that produce and reproduce inequality and racism. So all out here, although we are discussing the comments that are made, the attitudes, they reveal attitudes. But to be anti-racist, we do much more than changing people's attitudes. And that's why the focus on the responses, because it allows us to uncover the racial structure and the need for understanding how racism is reproduced. Bhopal has passionately argued that a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. So there is willful ignorance. There is ignoring of racism, and there's institutional response to racism, or lack of response, by offering unconscious bias training, EDI training, but these don't really alter the systems of oppression. And another way that actually happens in a higher education spaces, and this is what I looked at and this is the institutional response of failure to acknowledge racism. I looked at the course offerings of 10 universities for the Researcher Development Program and the PG CAP, that is the training for new staff. And not one mentioned anti-racism. 1 or 2 discussed decolonization, decolonial research methods, and 1 talked about LGBTQI issues. So this is significant. This preparation for new staff and future staff does not recognize racism. Similarly, peers found that addressing racism has low priority in initial teacher training, although there are subtle acts of racism continue to occur. So having discussed the forms of racism operating in HE and the response to racism, let us now discuss what this failure indicates, this failure to acknowledge racism. What does it reveal about higher education and about the people? Bonilla Silva in 2009 said that people typically avoid the topic of racism because they do not like to think of themselves as racist or as being somehow complicit in reproducing racism. So I would say that what does it indicate? Does it indicate lack of intelligence, lack of courage, or unwillingness to learn, to reflect, to share power? We all know, all of us in higher education know that HEIs insist that students should be critical in their academic work. But I ask, where's the reflection? Where's the learning and unlearning happening at the top levels of higher education? There seems to be a lack of critical thinking. There seems to be an unwillingness to share power. Education requires critical reflection. The concept and purpose of education have been analyzed by philosophers and scholars for centuries, from Plato to Aristotle, Dewey, Ambedkar, Gramsci, Freire, bell hooks. And they all talk about understanding. We might have differences because there were racist elements in some of the writings about education in terms of differential, different kinds of education offered in Plato. But the essence was about education should allow people to think, to question, not to accept things at face value. And that's what's being told to students. But there seems to be a reluctance to practice what we preach. Another way to understand the lack of engagement would be through the lens of racial capitalism, to understanding relations in society. So if we take the example of people saying that, why focus on racism? What about white working class? Let us step back and look at the attitudes to educating the laboring classes in 1800s UK. When there were people who wanted to have Sunday schools for the laboring classes, the children of the laboring classes, and there was opposition to it. And they said, no, we want to train them in the habits of industry and piety. And Raymond William points out that they were not taught writing and arithmetic because these were considered dangerous subjects, less necessary or even harmful. And O'Day mentions that the child was never taught to think critically or encouraged to become actively literate. There was fierce opposition. If you read the Hansard documents, and there was a bill in 1807 that was under discussion, and the Tory MP, Davis Giddy, fiercely opposed it, saying that education for the laboring classes would harm their morals and happiness. It would teach them to despise their lot in life instead of making them good servants. And he said, instead of teaching them subordination, it would enable them to read seditious pamphlets and become insolent to the superiors. So there are historical reasons why the working class, some children from the working class seem to be lagging behind. We shouldn't be blaming it on racism. And here the lens of racial capitalism will allow us to understand why there is a focus on widening participation. It seems to be to lure students to university. And here again, we should understand that in UK, there has been a demise of manufacturing and industrial capital. And so finance capital strides into higher education, tries to expand credit markets in the form of student loans. So students are being drawn into capitalist credit relations, but this is portrayed as a noble gesture of drawing in previously underrepresented groups into HE. So far from empowering students, the fee regime, the student loans are trapping students into relations of debt. But at the same time, it's boosting, kind of creating the illusion of that the economy is expanding. So these predatory practices are still continuing. But capital is always in search of new markets. And the new markets now, the trend and the frenzy that's going on of predatory inclusion of international students, preying upon international students, trying to get them to come to universities. But as we saw in one of the statements, at the same time, wanting them, capitalist state wants international students to come in, wants them to come in with their money, but at the same time, dehumanizing them, devaluing their knowledge by saying that they need to be taught British values. So there's a differential value assigned to these students and to their knowledges. So racial capitalism allows to see racism and capitalism as entangled, because racism enables the inequalities that capitalism requires. Capital thrives on divisions and inequalities. As Charles Mills has pointed out, that racist logic to demarcate as superior and white humanity and deficient Black non-humans contributes to racial division of wealth and human value. And that's what capitalism in all its forms has used that racial logic to demarcate as superior and inferior. So these race-making practices are kind of intrinsic to capitalist accumulation. So returning to the absence of focus on racism in the researcher development programs, as we saw in the 1800s, there's a reluctance to equip the PGRs and staff to develop critical consciousness of racial capitalism. Capitalism tries to conceal, obfuscate, and it uses the seductive appeal of PR technology to distract. So you have innovative research methods so that you're blind and oblivious of the intensification of work. And that's why there is no discussion of racism in, I would say, I've not fully developed this point, but I would say that in postgraduate research. And this is where we are kind of complicit by not questioning and arguing for that. I'm coming to the last few points now, and I'd say that I've offered no quick fixes, no ready-made solutions to creating an anti-racism culture. But if we want to say that there's no racism, we need to understand power relations and be willing to share power. As Turpin notes, we have got to show up and do the work. Token gestures of demanding decolonization can't dismantle capitalist and racist structures. At the most, these are window dressing. Anti-racism should not be limited to demanding equality, diversity, inclusion, decolonization, but should call for overhauling power imbalances. Thank you. And I welcome any questions and any discussion here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. That was a really powerful presentation. Thank you very much. So if people have got any questions, please do type them into the chat box and I will ask Chrissy. I can see that also some people have got their hands up as well. So we've got about 18 minutes now for questions, so please do type them out. So Alicia Maycock, so thank you for joining us, Alicia. Thanks, Chrissy. It's always a pleasure to listen to you speak. My question is, what can students do to challenge the institutional barriers in higher education? We can try our best to change attitudes and assumptions towards other students. However, as a mixed student, it can be exhausting and daunting to challenge people in authority due to power imbalances between university staff and students.
Okay, before I answer Alicia's question, there was someone else who mentioned about the slides not following the presentation. Well, the slides were just a few slides I had just to illustrate a few points and to where there were certain facts and figures. So there was, that's why there was no, they were not synced with my presentation. Okay, yes, thank you for that, Alicia. What can students do to, people always say that, okay, the racial battle fatigue, it can be so daunting, it can wear you out. There are examples of staff who are leaving university sector because they said they just can't do it. They need to, they've just giving up the fight. It's just weighing them out. It's affecting their mental health. And it's absolutely, we can't say that, okay, all of us need to fight. Because yes, you can't. It's so difficult. And that's where finding, when I spoke about solidarity, and that's where you find networks, you find pockets of solidarity, and you will find that. Look for that, reach out to people, talk to as many. You might get people who shut you down, who just dismiss you. And I spoke about the response of dismissal, denial, deflecting, but look for pockets of solidarity. You might find that somewhere, you might not find, but and if it's affecting you, of course, you need self-care. You need to look after yourself. And as I have said, I've just recently heard of a staff member who's leaving the university. It's so disheartening that we say we have an anti-racism collective in the university and we can't, if people, don't want to fight, it's up to them. But yes, so thank you for that. I don't know whether I've answered your question, Alicia. And I think exposing rebellion, calling them out on it. So when you talk about institutional structures and systems, calling them out, one of the things that we got and introduced the Anti-Racism Collective, we got the university to introduce anonymized marking because our students told us about it. Alicia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, please do come back, Alicia, if you've got anything to add. Thank you, Chrissy. And for those asking whether the recording will be available, it normally takes about a week for our team here at the university to upload the talk to YouTube. And if you follow our Twitter account or our LinkedIn account, you'll get an update as to when the recording will be available. But normally it's about a week's time. So thank you for your comments. Hafsa, thank you for your comment as well. So I recommend CODE, the Centre of the Dynamics of Ethnicity ECR network. They're great people and great to find like-minded people. Thank you for that. Please do keep those questions and comments coming forwards. We've got another one here from Musharat. So thank you for putting into words what I think continuously, Chrissy. The data, the discussions are decades old and the outcome's the same from the research. And 60-odd government commissioned reports. The leadership and boards need to take responsibility for the structural, strategic and cultural change. It can't just be the grassroots doing the struggle for change. Are you in an institution that is taking a whole institutional approach to change? And if yes, what are they doing, Chrissy?
Thank you, Mush, for that. And nice to see Hafsha and Mush out here. Well, sadly, in our institution, no. We are just a handful of us who are breaking our heads, trying to get things done. And institutions really, and this is why I pitched it as it is based on experiences in this university and of course in my previous universities as well. They don't want to recognize, they don't want to. And this is why I said that we always are insisting that institutions, that students should be critical, but they keep on parroting things of the attainment gap. So words like that. So that gives you an indication how resistant they are to change, how resistant to learning and to engaging and understanding. So that's one example. So no, not in that. You're absolutely right. Decades old and the same issues. And that's why I say that, university sector has been always agitated to deal with issues. So right now it's about AI, artificial intelligence and AI, agitated on how we do deal with it. It was a few years ago about the pandemic and the online learning. Where's the agitation? Where's the urgency to deal with racism or with racial capitalism? No, it's missing it. Completely silent. They'll have token gestures, window dressing, but nothing. And I think that's what we have to keep, as Alicia said here, we have to keep at it and not give up. At some of us who can. So no, it's not. But we can have networks cross-institution solidarity, and that's what some of us try to do. And that's why I got to know as Mosh and Hafsa, and keep each other, just support and each other in ways that we can, and sharing things. So thank you for sharing the code, Hafsa. Solidarity, the struggle continues. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for these comments and questions. So, Chrissy, I was at the British Educational Research Association conference in September, and I listened to an academic called Linda Smith talk about decolonizing in research. And there are actually a lot of similarities in some of the points that you made about this idea of not just, I think what one of Linda's key messages was, certainly that I took from the talk, was not just changing existing systems, but also creating new ones. And also what Linda did was really break down the micro level steps that people can take to almost kind of raise more awareness, and thinking about how even in meeting agendas, they need to be decolonized. And we need to think almost much more broadly about how we tackle racism. So What does it mean to you to kind of disrupt knowledges, as you spoke about earlier in your talk?
I was going to ask you whether it's Linda Smith from and Penny has put that. Thanks, Penny. Yes, she does talk about breaking it down. So,
And
what do I mean by disrupting racial myths?
yeah,
And I think this is what the research that Gilborn and Mirza did in schools in London, where Black students performed at age 5. When they tested them, they were 20 points ahead of the national average. And when they left school at age 16, they were 20 points below the national average. So that means there's something gone wrong. They came in as bright, intelligent beings, but then the education system failed them. And I think, so this is what, I mean, people need to take account of that. But that research has not even, I mean, that should be on everyone's minds. That should be, every university should be doing the soul searching. What has gone wrong? Why are we failing our children? But we don't do that. It's just sidelined, it's forgotten. So that would be one way of that. Finding out things, and that's why I say do the work, read, investigate. We were at a meeting earlier with Penny talking about what we could do with the context of Palestine and the atrocities, the violence, and said that we need to do the work. We need to educate ourselves. So that would be the disrupting, about educating yourself, finding out things, issues, trying, and then sharing it, discussing with others. So constantly keep at it. And that's one way that I mean by disrupting. Thank you, Sana, about this decolonial critique.
thank you. And I can see that Penny has shared the link to Linda's talk, Vera, which was a fantastic keynote. So thank you for that, Penny. We've also got some questions in the question answer section. So as a Black person in academia myself, how much should I continue going at it until it's time to take a break? Unfortunately, that's from an anonymous attendee, so we don't know the name, but that was one of the questions there. What would you respond to that, Chrissy?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So as a Black person in academia myself, how much should I continue going at this until it's time to take a break?
I would say listen to yourself. If you are feeling that it is too much, your health is should be your primary concern. We can all try to change the world, but if it's going to affect us, that should be our focus. Sometimes, let someone else take the thing, take a step back, and then maybe come back at it later on. So I would say that prioritize your health first. It is, as I said, the term racial battle fatigue really kind of encapsulates what people experience. Being constantly told that, or being questioned, or hyper surveillance that takes place. And this is one example. We're talking about what you could do. I'll give an example about a friend of mine started work in academia as a Black person, did her studies, and she was told every week she had to give her lesson plan. And this was about 20 odd years ago. And when technology went up, so she was at the printer one day, printing it out. And one of our other colleagues asked her, what are you doing? And she said, I'm creating my lesson plan. And he was a colleague from the same department. And he said, I joined a few months before you. I've never been asked to do this. Why are you doing it? A white colleague. And you tell the line manager or the head of the department that you're not going to do it. And if she asks you why you haven't done it, say, because Alan said he was never asked to do it. So we don't need white saviors, but you need people to stand in solidarity with you. So he was willing to put his head above the parapet and say, if she asked you why you haven't done it, say, Alan has never been asked to do it, so why should I do it? So find, yes, as I said, you don't need white saviors, but look out for people and you will find people who will support you. I hope. Yes.
Thank you. And thank you, Jenny. Thank you for your nice comments. And thank you for joining us. So we've got another question about how do we safely manage the instance when in attending meetings in person and humour is used and the person is the butt of the joke. What would you respond to that, Chrissy?
I was looking on, it takes, sometimes you can be, it just throws you. Like when a staff was told you can't park out here, you can't enter out here, you're stunned into silence sometimes. And you don't know what to do. And you notice, and that's what when that report, that tactic racial harassment said, that people face racism, comments made in plain sight in front of other colleagues. So what do? One is you could tell them that, well, you're not very funny, and they dismiss it, oh, it's just a joke. Then you need to learn to be funnier. It takes time, it takes confidence, and sometimes you may not. I'll give you another example, and sometimes I kick myself because of not having spoken up. I was at an author was presenting her work, Black author, presenting her work, I think mixed heritage, presenting her work. And she said that she loved reading and she didn't see children books that reflected her as a child. So when she became an adult, she started writing books and she had characters, Black characters, mixed heritage characters. And after a very fascinating talk, and at the end of her talk, someone asked her, the first question that was asked to her, so when you said you write about characters like you, do you write about knife crime? And I clocked that, but I didn't, I was sitting at the back there, I didn't raise it. And I raised it to the organizers after that. And the organizer thanked me for raising the point. And he said, I also clocked that, but I didn't speak up. But it's asking a question, do you talk about knife crime? Is that the only issue that Black people, he could have asked, do you write about issues about stop and search? That the most number of stop and search are for Black people. But no, that issue doesn't come about. Black people are without criminals. So do you write about these issues? And we don't speak up. And I think it takes time, it takes effort to speak up. And we will find sometimes. I'll give you the example I spoke about, we should destroy all the Arabs in the context of deciding the reading list. I overheard that conversation within two people talking about the reading list. Why all medieval history is about Arab history? Why, where's European and that? I kept quiet because I thought, it's not my place, it's the librarian's issue. But when they said the statement about we should destroy Arabs, and I said, are you aware of what you said? And do you know that without Arabs, we would not have astronomy, we would not have mathematics, and should reflect. And I did raise that. So it's not easy. I kick myself sometimes for not having spoken up. But I think we all need to kind of, get better at it, practice, and yes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, please do let us know. I mean, these are really powerful stories, and like you, that they stun you when you read them and when you hear them. This is probably going to be the final question. So it's from Luckman. So thank you for your question. Racism in universities is a diffusion of racism in the general society. Can university racism be treated differently and only?
Racism in the university happens in the university and it should be dealt in the university. But when you mean differently, it depends on what kind of it. If it is a name calling, if it is that, and it's similar to what happens elsewhere, or whether it is a subtle racism, saying that how many of the tribe are coming for your graduation, because Black people are tribal, and then say it's a joke. So it depends on what kind of racism it is. There is racism in terms of towards students, in terms of marking. Students said that they feel that they've been discriminated based on the names and surnames. So you can tell if the surname is Ali, you know that the person is, a Muslim background. So you can identify people. So it depends on what. I don't know whether I've answered your question, Lukman, because, or would you like to clarify what do you mean of different? What different from? racism happening out there on the streets.
Yeah, and then please do clarify, Lukman, if you've got time. I guess in terms of are incidents unique in the university setting that perhaps we don't see in wider society, or is it just a reflection? Is an interesting consideration. I can see that it is 5 o'clock though. Alison, that's a really nice comment. So Alison suggests that speak up and speak out, even if your voice shakes, is my motto. And I think that that's probably kind of captures the whole hour here really well. I think as well in terms of that question of where's the urgency is really poignant from your talk today, Chrissy. And I'd really like to thank you for your time and in sort of pulling this presentation together and sharing your thoughts, and also for everybody that's given up their time this afternoon to join us and your comments and questions. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a good festive period over the next few weeks. Thank you.
Phil, could I say one thing? Could you copy the questions and from the Q&A and the chat? Because in case there's something I can respond to, people's names are there. I would like to respond at some time. So if you could copy that in a document or something before you end the
Absolutely.
call. Thanks.
And please look out for the recording, which will be available hopefully before Christmas. Thank you so much, Chrissy.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks, everyone.
So I'm just going to stop recording.
And you